Many of you may be familiar with the name John Paul Hammerschmidt as Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt, but you may not know the rest of the story, which brings us here to the Arkansas Air Museum in Fayetteville, where you can find John Paul Hammerschmidt portrayed through the Arkansas Aviation Hall of Fame, and rightfully so. You see, before entering politics, John Paul was Second Lieutenant Hammerschmidt, who happened to be a highly decorated combat pilot in the Army Air Corps during World War II. He flew 217 missions with the 3rd Combat Cargo Group over treacherous territory known as the Hump in the China-Burma-India theater. They were missions that became legendary, earning Second Lieutenant John Paul the Distinguished Flying Cross and many other highest military honors. Later, enter his political career. In 1967, Hammerschmidt became the first Republican from Arkansas to serve in Congress since the Reconstruction period. A native of Harrison, Congressman Hammerschmidt represented the 3rd District in the U.S. House of Representatives, having been elected to 13 terms and serving 26 years during the administrations of 6 presidents. He was the original sponsor of congressional authorization for a National Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He also initiated the legislation which preserved the Buffalo River as a free-flowing stream, designating it as America's first national river. Former U.S. Senator and Arkansas Governor David Pryor visited with Congressman Hammerschmidt in his hometown and brings us a most informative and inspiring conversation with one of Arkansas's men of distinction, the Honorable John Paul Hammerschmidt.
Well, Congressman Hammerschmidt, here we are. Here we are in your hometown, where I believe in 1922 you were born. Let's talk a little bit about your early life and your grandparents coming here and your business associations and your family here. And we'd love to hear some of that early history from you.
Thank you, David. Before I get into talking about my family and my early life, let me say what a pleasure it is to have such a distinguished interviewer.
I'm not a real good interviewer, but we're just going to have a visit. Thank you very much.
It's really great always to be with you and an old friend.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I was born and raised here in Harrison, went to school here. My grandparents came here on my mother's side. They came in wagon trains from Tennessee, settled here in Boone County. On my father's side, they came around through Illinois from Missouri on down here in 1911. They were German descent. My grandmother was born in Germany, and my grandfather was 2nd generation German. And he established a lumber business here in 1911. His business was right down off the Harrison Square. And that particular lumberyard's gone now, but he had businesses up and down the railroad where we had timber and sawmills and lumber manufacturing as well as a retail lumber business. So those are kind of my roots in business.
Well, during this time, were your grandparents and then ultimately in the next generation, your parents, were they involved in politics itself or mostly in business?
No, they were in business. And let me go back to say about my parents that my father, after my mother and dad were married, they found 10 acres right next to the city limits across Crooked Creek where we 5 kids grew up. And it was wonderful because we had the farm life of having cows, which we had to milk. We had a pony. We had a wonderful gardens, flower gardens and vegetable gardens that my mother had us all help tend. It was just a wonderful life growing up there, but still being in town, so to speak. We were just across the creek from being in this town of Harrison.
I had the privilege of seeing this particular home in which you lived until you were 15, literally right on the banks of Crooked Creek, one of the more pristine and beautiful creeks in Arkansas. And so you milked the cows, and it was almost adjacent to town, but yet it was in the country. It is such a remarkable place, and to see your home place where you grew up.
Right, there were 5 of us kids. I had an older sister, Zeta June. I had twin sisters, Elaine and Elizabeth. Then I was next, and then my younger brother, Bob Hammerschmidt, all deceased except me.
And so you are the remaining Hammerschmidt of the so-called tribe, with the exception of your fine son, John Arthur Hammerschmidt. We'll talk about John Arthur here in just a little bit when we get a little further down the line. But John Paul, were your family members on your grandfather's and father's side, were these political people? Were they activists in the community? Did they take part in Democrat or Republican politics?
No, they were only activists, like as in the Rotary Club and the Chamber of Commerce, but certainly not in politics.
So they didn't say, now, John Paul, you've got to be a Republican because that's where the future is. Nor did they say, we want you to toe the line and be like the rest of the county and the rest of northwest Arkansas and the state. We want you to align yourself with the Democrats. There was no family pressure in that regard.
My father would have been amazed if he knew that I'd run for public office.
John Paul, World War II. World War II was, I guess, sort of maybe a milestone, but certainly a defining moment, a period in the life of John Paul Hammerschmidt. Tell us a little about that.
Well, before that, I went to the Citadel. I graduated when I was 15 years old, so I went there quite young. I was 16, actually.
When you attended
when I was
the Citadel.
At the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. In those days, that was a long ways from home, you know, on the East Coast. There were 3 of us from Harrison went to the Citadel. They have a regimen there, just like the military academies do. You go through plebe, and so you got a lot of training. So I had that experience before I got into the Annapolis appointment opportunities. And so, as you just mentioned, I did go to see Congressman Clyde Ellis. My father took me there on where his office was in the square in Bentonville. And he interviewed me, and then he gave me an appointment to Annapolis. And at the same time, my roommate from the Citadel, David Fitton from Harrison, had been offered a West Point appointment, but it was 1 year after my Annapolis one would have been. So my folks and his folks thought, well, it'd be nice if they both went to the academy at the same time. So I deferred my first appointment and accepted another appointment, which Clyde Ellis was kind enough to grant. And then I went to the University of Arkansas while I was waiting for that to transpire. And on December of that year, I went out to California to see my cousin without any permission from my folks or anyone. Pearl Harbor had just happened on December 7th. So I went out there and I found it so fascinating in a different world that I stayed and went to work in Mare Island Navy Yard. And
what did you do in the Navy Yard?
I became a helper for the pipe cover and insulators people. And I worked on many ships that had been, one had been in Pearl Harbor, the USS Raleigh, which was a 4-stack cruiser, and I worked on that ship. I worked on, it was a submarine base actually, but I worked on a lot of ships. And became very aware that the war was going on. We had barrage balloons up all over Mare Island, and so it was a war atmosphere. And here I was, yet not ready for the draft, but realizing that I had to do something. So instead of accepting that Annapolis appointment, I joined the Army Air Corps and went through pilot training, which was a great disappointment to my folks, but they were glad that I got through pilot training.
So all of a sudden you found yourself in the Air Force, and did you have any choice about your choices there? Were they limited at that time, or were you just assigned?
Well, when we got out and got our wings and our second lieutenant bars, why, you didn't have any choice about where you went or what kind of a plane you were going to fly. So for a while I flew navigators that they were training out of San Marcos, Texas. We'd fly to California and you know, we had 3 young navigator students there and a navigator instructor, and we were flying AT-7s at that time. And that was quite an experience. So while I was doing that, I thought, now how can you get in the war, you know, get into some action? So we saw on the bulletin board, several of us saw where they were looking for pilots to go overseas. And so we immediately volunteered for that, and we were sent down to West Palm Beach, Florida, and began to fly an airplane that we had never flown before, C-47s. And so 104 of us left West Palm Beach, Florida, and went through South America to Belém, Brazil, the Ascension Islands, through Central Africa, and on eventually over to the Tibetan border.
For his achievements and tremendous courage, John Paul was inducted into the Arkansas Aviation Hall of Fame. But that was only for starters.
You ultimately were the recipient of, if I'm not mistaken, the 4 flying, what would that be? The
Distinguished Flying Cross.
Distinguished Flying Cross, 4 of these. Now, I don't think there are many people who can claim that. Is that, am I correct there?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah. There you go. You don't like to talk, you don't like to brag about yourself, but I think I think it is true that very few times have many Americans been, you know, awarded.
It's a great honor to receive one.
Yes. John Paul, when you think about your military career, you were the recipient of many awards, many medals, many honors, very distinguished service to our military in World War II and thereafter. What lessons do you come away from that lesson of service?
Well, obvious, other than the major goals which were accomplished in the defeat of the Axis powers in Europe and the Japanese powers, the main thing is that everybody discovered the world in that era, I being one of them, and I being one of millions who did their duty, just went to war.
You were a member of the Tom Brokaw Great Generation. You were one of those.
Well, there were millions of us, and I'm proud to be of that age, of course, but I have to be a pilot to get in my own service. I have to be a pilot in World War II. And on my overseas duties, I was in China, Burma, and India. And I flew the Himalayan mountains, and that had a term called the hump. But actually, in addition to flying the hump from India to Kunming or to Chanyi, China, across the Himalaya mountains, we did a major amount of dropping to jungle warfare people like the Mars Task Force and the Merrill's Marauders. And it's a very interesting bit of service over there. The biggest factor, other than just Japanese Zeros, but the major factor was weather. And over those mountains, that was all unsurveyed, and it was all mostly on instruments, so you didn't know for sure whether you're going to run into a mountain or not because you couldn't see, and a lot of people did run into mountains over there, so we lost a lot of planes to weather and to terrain, a few to enemy fire as well. But it was an interesting bit of history.
And you were actually a pilot for how long?
Well, I flew 217 combat missions, but I was a pilot all the time during World War II, and then I stayed in Army Air Force Reserve for 20 years.
Was there a time in World War II when you were flying the hump and doing the things that you were doing when you thought you might not get back?
Oh, you thought that nearly every day, but you're young and you don't worry about things like that when you're 20 years old. That's the right time to be flying combat, and many people have done it. Many people have done it, and these new pilots and new technology that we have are absolutely amazing to me. Back when we were there, our instruments were nothing but a radio compass and an altimeter. And now they have so much more to go on, but they also have a lot harder
Sure.
machines to maneuver.
Sure.
It's the main thing. Everybody went and did their duty, and if you got back in one piece, you can be thankful. That's the whole story.
I bet you were glad to get back to Harrison, Arkansas.
I was glad to get back to
And
the United States.
I would bet they were glad to get you back.
Well, I was glad to be back, of course. You know, along that line, when I did come back, we assumed we were going on to Japan. And I went out to California. When I first got back, I went to California. And everybody just assumed that we were getting ready to make a major invasion of Japan. And that was in July of '45, and then we dropped the bomb.
August of '45, we dropped the bomb.
That ended that real worry and probably saved maybe 10 million lives. So.
Do you remember the day the bomb was dropped? Do you remember the day it was dropped? Do you remember hearing it on the radio?
I do.
I remember hearing it.
I remember very well. Just another little side story. 40 years later, I was in Hiroshima with Jim Wright once again, and was there on the 40th anniversary of the time that the bomb was dropped. We were there with these Japanese, and they made their speech, and Jim Wright made a speech, and he was very good with words, but he also kind of let them know, well, you all started it.
Right.
It was quite a momentous occasion.
I bet it was.
They were very polite. Japanese are polite people. But we were there 40 years later.
And you ultimately received about every award that any veterans organization, whatever they might be, whether it be the American Legion or what have you, many, many high awards.
Yeah, those came mainly because I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee in Congress.
And you were very active in all of those endeavors during all that time. We mentioned one son, John Arthur Hammerschmidt. And John Arthur himself has had a very interesting and distinguished career. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, John Arthur, of course, grew up here in Harrison as well, but he went off to prep school at Woodbury Forrest up in Orange, Virginia, before I even considered at all running for Congress. So actually we joined him when we moved to Washington. And then he went on from there to Dartmouth College, where he graduated from there, and then he went to Vanderbilt, and then he went on to Harvard Business School. And then after that, he came back and ran our family business for several years till he finally sold that to some old family friends of ours from Springfield, Missouri, the Meeks. And then he went back to Washington and became a member of the National Transportation Safety Board, where he served for 18 years and actually quit as acting chairman of that organization. And then now he serves in Homeland Security in the Transportation Division there.
But he lives basically in Washington.
Lives in Arlington, Virginia.
In Arlington, Virginia. And John Arthur's mother and your wonderful partner of some 57 years, Virginia. And I believe about 1947 you became married. She was a Boone County product also, is that correct?
That's right. She was born in Bellefonte, and Virginia is the guiding force in our family, and always has been.
On January 2nd, 2006, after battling with cancer and pneumonia, Virginia Hammerschmidt, affectionately known as Jenny, died at the age of 77.
You come back from the war, and you come back to Harrison, Arkansas, and you said, okay, I think I'm going to commit myself to the family business. And let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, yes, I did the logical thing. My father ran the business, so I went in the business also, of course.
Well, did people say to you, now, John Paul Hammerschmidt, here you are, you've come back, you're a young businessman, you're married and whatever, and you shouldn't be fooling around with these Republicans because there's no Republicans, there's no future. Were you hearing some of that at that time? Or?
No, I didn't. As I mentioned about my father, he was always said, don't discuss religion or politics. But he was still living when I was active in politics, but he would never have thought about me running myself for public office. He died before that. He died in '63. But I always thought about, does it affect our business? But I didn't let it deter me in any way. I went right ahead with what I believed in.
So, John Paul, here we are in the spring, 1966. Winthrop Rockefeller is in the race for governor. They're looking for someone to run in the 3rd Congressional District, where I think you said that there was the potential for growth of the Republican Party seemed to be at that time more evident. But they couldn't quite come up with someone. Jerry Henshaw says, no, I've done that before, I don't want to do that again. And so what happens next? How do they decide to field a candidate like John Paul Hammerschmidt from Harrison to take on the venerable, I might say, Jim Trimble of Arkansas?
Well, as you mentioned, I was state chairman and was working on the Rockefeller campaign on a regular basis, meeting with all of what we called his brain trust. And we were sitting there and thinking, well, we have to have somebody in the 3rd District. I'd already discussed with Jerry Henshaw, and he declined to run. And so it was getting close to filing time, and Wynn said, well, why don't you run, to me? And I said, well, he kidded me about this later, but I said, I don't mind supporting prima donnas, I just don't want to be one. And so I declined for the time being, but I thought, well, it's getting pretty serious, getting close to filing time. So the next day, or maybe the day following that, I decided to go ahead and run, and so I filed. And then I realized that it was getting it was a serious decision. I had to rethink through what I was going to do with our business and what I was going to do with my time and how I was going to structure my campaign and so on and so forth. So I got very involved in that, and I decided the type of campaign I was going to run. And I was still, on the same time, involved in the Rockefeller campaign. I would meet with them every Saturday morning down in the Tower Building, and we'd go over Wynn's campaign. At the same time, I was on the side structuring my campaign.
Did they say to you, well, John Paul, we're going to give you some help from the state party up in your district, or did they feel encouraged? Or did you feel like you might be just a sort of a throwaway candidate that they were using at that time? Did you ever sense that?
Since it was really my decision and their decision, I didn't feel that way at all. Once I filed, I thought, well, this is serious, and I really need to try to win. So I tried to develop a strategy of how I might win. I decided to run a separate campaign from the Rockefellers, although the Rockefeller momentum was very much a part of the atmosphere. But I ran my campaign entirely separately. I ran a different type campaign. I ran different type ads. I would be in the Tower Building, and Hugh Pollard, or Al Pollard, was one of their advertising people, and they would have me a slick campaign poster all devised, and it looked just like a slick ad. And I would take it into Al Pollard's office and write it like a grocery store ad. I would totally redo it because I thought that looks like a Rockefeller activity. So I wanted to divorce myself. Now, not that I didn't support Wynn, but there were two separate thinkers. So I wanted to make it look that way. So I was very careful to separate all my ads away from Wynn. And we only, in that campaign, I ran a 100-day campaign, and we only appeared together about 3 or 4 times.
This was some years back. What about polling at that time? Were there polls out there?
There were polls. I got a hold of Orville Faubus's old pollster, who I consider to be the best pollster in Arkansas, because he used real live people that he had posted all across the state. So we made a deal that he would do polls for me, and he did 5 altogether.
His name?
Gene Newsom.
Gene Newsom.
And when we first started, by that time I had 16% name recognition, which was, he said, he thought was rather high at that time for somebody that had never been in office. Then he started doing these polls, and I used to have the charts, but is I would gradually get radio ads and get some newspaper ads, and then later, way later, got some television ads. Those polls went from 16 to 23 to 25 to 28. The last one, I may not be telling that exactly right, but the last one on the Tuesday before the election was 45-45 with 10% undecided. And so he said, you're going to peak. He said, you're peaking just right, and you're probably going to get 53 to 54% of the vote. I had no idea whether that was correct or not, but I knew he was good. And so I got 53.4% of the vote. And so I wasn't totally surprised when I got elected.
John Paul Hammerschmidt became the first Republican from Arkansas to come to Washington in 100 years, the first to be elected to Congress since the Reconstruction period.
Well, I remember John Paul going to, this is a personal matter here between you and me, I think you recall this. I remember seeing you up there in the halls a few days after the election when we were up there looking, you know, trying to find office space and place to live and whatever. And I said, well, John Paul Hammerschmidt, my gosh, I said, I didn't think you were going to get here. And you looked at me, you said, I didn't think you were either. So we started off, both of us, like that, on the same footing. But my relationship and membership in the House was very, very interesting and has always been warm, and I've always enjoyed that. You come to Washington in January of 1967. Did you have an agenda? Did you have some things that you wanted to do as a congressman?
No, not specifically. First, we went to briefings, you know. They gave us briefings. I forgot the name of that place down there, some think tank house. And Mel Laird and Jerry Ford and people like that gave us briefings about what Congress was all about. And of course, I got a book that explained what Congress was all about and what the duties and remunerations were of
Right.
the job.
Our class on the Democratic side that year, as I recall, had 14 members in the class. There were 14 of us. I think there were more Republicans, and I'm not sure. But there was one Republican on the congressman from Houston, from the Houston area, who you became very, very closely aligned with and personally identified with as a friend, and probably his best friend in your class, and maybe even in the whole Congress, was Congressman George Herbert Walker Bush. Talk about that relationship a little bit.
Well, we developed a close relationship, and we did a lot of things together, and we kind of thought alike, and had a lot of private discussions, and we ran around together, and George had a boat down on the river, and he always loved fast boats, and so when we were just freshmen, we had time to go down the river on that boat and tie up at that wharf outside of Mount Vernon and have beer and cheese and crackers and come back, and we had a lot of fun, great experiences together.
John Paul, what about you served with 6 presidents? Let's talk about some of those presidents. You served with LBJ. That was the first president. You served with Nixon, with Ford, with Jimmy Carter, with George Herbert Walker Bush, and
Reagan.
And of course President Reagan. 6 presidents. Sort of walk through those, if you would, just a moment, and give me your flashback memories in a condensed form.
Well, that'd be kind of hard
Yes,
to
it would.
condense, but let me say this, that when there was a Republican president in office there, many times I was the only Republican from Arkansas. So as such, I would have people come by to see me from Blytheville and from El Dorado and from Pine Bluff and from Forrest City, because I had that White House contact. And so that gave me sort of a statewide recognition, you know, because people would bring their views to me just like they would to you.
Well, do you remember meeting LBJ? President?
Yes, I do remember meeting him very well. I tell you a story about that. It may be too long, but I'll tell you real quick. David, when we first went there, Ward Goodman, who was then director of the highways, called me, and I guess he called all of our delegation, but he called our office, and I talked with him personally. And he said, Congressman, our road beds are deteriorating. We've got $50 million worth of road beds on the interstates that are deteriorating because the president has the highway funds frozen. And it's just bad economics. So I didn't have enough sense but to call the White House and made an appointment. You know what, now, after I got more senior, I wouldn't have done that way at all. But 4 of us had the same problem in our districts. I've forgotten the other 3, actually. But 4 of us went down there and made an appointment with the White House. He was going to give us 15 minutes. And we went down to the White House, and he said, all right, fellas, I know. And, of course, he was all briefed about why we were going to be there. He said, let me tell you, we got a war on. And he said, I've got funds frozen everywhere. He said, I got funds frozen for the military housing. I got funds frozen for the poor folks housing. I got road funds frozen. He said, you know, I got a lot of tough decisions to make. He said, let me take a poll just among you 4 here. He said, which ones of you think I ought to unfreeze the poor folks housing? He said, hold up your hand. We didn't hold up our hand. He said, how about the military housing, HUD housing? He said, none of us held up our hands. He said, how about roads? Of course, we all held up our hands. Yeah. He said, all right, let me tell you what I'm going to do. He said, you all got press secretaries? We all said, yeah. I didn't have a press secretary, but I had a staff. But anyway, he said, you go back and tell your press secretary to say you were down and you saw the president, and he's going to release whatever the figure was, you know, $600 million nationally of federal highway funds next Friday or something like that. Of course, he'd already had it all planned. We didn't have anything to do with it, but we happened to be there at an opportune time. So we went back, and I called Ward Goodman. I didn't issue any press release. I told him that the president said he's going to release the fund. So LBJ kind of won me over. I went up there very disliking him very much. He kind of won me over the first month I was there. He was good.
He was a master, wasn't he?
He was something.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll have a few good little memories of him.
You know, one more little LBJ story. You know how they'd have us all out in the White House when we were freshmen, and in that whatever room that is where they have all that. And so Virginia was picking up, you know, finger sandwiches, and big old hand came around and reached around and he said, can I help you, honey? He said, it was LBJ, you know, and I scared Virginia to death. You know?
Oh, my.
I help you, honey. And, you know, he just going around the table, just kind of
he was sort of
hugging
uncontrollable, really. He was just uncontrollable.
Yeah.
He was
amazing guy.
He was an amazing guy.
I've listened to his tapes.
His tapes are so funny and
If
great.
you listen to the 2 sets of tape that Beckloff has done, they're just wonderful.
They're very good parts of our history.
They are.
Nixon, tell us about Richard Nixon. What was your working relationship?
I had a close relationship with Richard Nixon when I was running in the '66 race.
You came in '69 to the Arkansas-Texas game with him, I know.
Yeah, but before that, when I was running in 1966, Richard Nixon came down here in a joint meeting with Gwen Rockefeller and myself to Fort Smith, Arkansas on Friday before the election, I think it was. And then Jerry Ford came the very next day and went to Huntsville. Jerry Ford, by that time, our polls had kind of leaked out that I maybe had a chance. So Jerry Ford came down and took him down to Huntsville from Springdale, and we got up on top of a big old hay rack in the middle of the football field. And Jerry Ford said, where are we? And I said, well, you're in Orville Faubus's hometown. That identified. He said, oh. You know, I said, you're in Orville Faubus's hometown. So,
and anyway, you were at a football game?
No, it was just a political appearance.
I see, yes.
But Nixon came down to that to help me. So, you know, but we were close ever since.
Jimmy Carter. What about Jimmy Carter? Remember him? And serving with him?
Yeah. You know, I was on the Select Committee on Aging, and I was ranking member of it with Claude Pepper. So when Jimmy was president, we got Rosalind Carter, because of Claude Pepper's influence, to chair a congressional aging committee. I'm trying to think of the name of it, but like a White House committee, we decided to do a congressional committee so we could get something done with it, and Rosalind chaired that. So we had a pretty good, close relationship with Rosalind. President Carter never did ever get his act totally together. But Jimmy Carter, I think, was a man of real principle and meant very well, and maybe too much so. He was always wanting to turn the other cheek too much.
President Ronald Reagan.
Well, of course, he was great. He was just, I thought he was terrific in the way he could communicate with people. He knew where he wanted the country to go. He appointed people that took him in that direction, and he stayed behind the scenes. In public appearances, you couldn't beat him in his appearances.
He stayed very focused.
I was up at Camp David with him. I have a picture over there of us up there at Camp David. We enjoyed that.
President George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush won, and I know your friendship in the House, and here he comes to elected to the presidency, and you still remain very close during those years as you do now.
Yes, we were very close, yeah.
And he had you on many occasions, I think, to sort of seek your counsel.
Yeah, we did several things. He appointed me on a commission after the Lockerbie Pan Am 103 tragic accident. I was on the National Committee on Security and Terrorism. That's one of the things aside that I did while he was there. And we wrote a report, and Jim Oberstar, my colleague in Minnesota, says if they'd have followed our report, they wouldn't have had 9/11. Wow. That might be true. But because we did, it's an interesting report to read.
That report, which came out in 1990, 11 years before 9/11, contained more than 60 recommendations designed to improve civil aviation security to deter and prevent terrorist attacks, the majority of which were never implemented until after 9/11.
Let me, if I could, go back to an eventual campaign that we've not talked about, and that would be your political campaign for re-election in the year 1974. There was a young law professor at the University of Arkansas named William Jefferson Clinton, and he decided that he wanted to be a congressman, and he wanted your seat. So let's talk about that campaign a moment.
What do
you remember about that campaign, John Paul?
Well, I remember that I was tied up in Congress, and I knew that here was this very bright, personal young man, and I sort of knew a little of his reputation about how good he was at speaking and communicating with people. And so I knew that that was a threatening opponent, but I couldn't do much about it. I came back and still worked in my district offices, but I only saw people in a business sense. And so I didn't really campaign till we adjourned the Congress. And we only had 17 days in '74 for that to happen. So I knew that it was going to be very close. I did have access to his polls. I had a mole in his operation, and so I did see his polls at the same time I saw my polls. His pollster, I'm trying to think of his name, I still see him on television. They had a falling out. But that campaign was a tough one, but I didn't have long to run it. I did a lot of television, a lot of radio, and trying to Bill didn't always exactly tell the way it really was. You know, he has a real knack with words, and that always irritated me because I thought he was leaving the wrong impression about my voting record and about many other things about me. But nevertheless.
Congressman Hammerschmidt was the author and initiating sponsor of the legislation which preserved the Buffalo River in North Arkansas as a free-flowing stream. After it was added to the National Park System in 1972, the Buffalo River became America's first national river.
John Paul, the late Justice William O. Douglas of the United States Supreme Court would come to the Buffalo River, float the river, and declare it as the most beautiful scenic river in America, maybe in North America. This probably would have never have happened, a scenic river, without some legislation that you took on and you proposed to create the Buffalo River as a scenic river. Talk about that.
Well, that's probably true. I was very aware of Justice Douglas's trips down here, as well as other celebrities. I had to try, after I decided that I wanted to leave the Buffalo a free-flowing stream, then I had to develop a political base for that was stronger than the opponents of that idea, in the Congress as well as in the constituency. And so I had to think about how to do that. By the time I was there, let's say 2 or 3 terms, I began to develop that strategy. And Congressman Aspinall.
Wayne Aspinall.
Wayne was the head of the Interior Committee. And Wayne was never particularly friendly with me because I think a lot of these older members had been very close to Judge Trimble, and they thought, here's this young upstart that's come up here and taken Judge Trimble's place, and they didn't know how to evaluate me. But over a period of time, I was able to develop their friendship and confidence, at least. So I talked with Wayne Aspinall about the Buffalo River, and his counterpart on the Republican side was John Saylor from Pennsylvania. So John Saylor had been down to the Buffalo himself. I don't think Wayne ever came down here, but anyway, finally I said, now I'm going to introduce this bill. I had it drafted, and so I really got his blessing behind the scenes to go ahead with it. When I drafted that Buffalo River bill, I think I got all of our delegation to sign on to it on the House side because I thought that it needed that strength. And so here I had, I think probably David, you were signed on to it, and Bill Alexander and Wilbur and so on. But anyway, it took quite a little bit of doing to get that bill through. But the Department of Interior was strongly for it. The Corps of Engineers, of course, were not for it. But that all developed into the Buffalo River National Park.
How close did we come as a state, as a people, to putting a dam on the Buffalo River?
Well, we came fairly close, but one of the governors put an actual stop to it. I think it was Fayetteville, maybe. I believe it was, which put a stay on it. And so, but it would have developed just like the rest of our other streams, but it was necessary that we pass legislation to ensure that it'd be a free-flowing stream. But when we did that, then, of course, we set the groundwork, and then it became the Buffalo National River.
But all the cards were lined up, especially at one time, that this dam was on its way to being constructed. I mean,
yes. At one time, originally there were 2 dams, and then the Corps changed their Lone Star and Lone Rock and Gilbert, and then they changed it to 1 dam, and they were getting close to wanting to start on it, but they never did get the total endorsement of the Congress. And then you had a lot of people, especially in the Little Rock area, but we also had some people like Dr. Neil Compton
from Bentonville.
Neil Compton. And,
he was a one-man crusade.
Others were, the Ozark Society was established by then. The Hedges had moved down here, Harold Hedge, Margaret Hedges. And those type people were very strong supporters of the river side of the issue. So, but it all came out good. I think it's been a great thing, and even today, people that were strongly opposed, now that they've been relocated and reestablished their lives, I think they too think it was probably a good thing.
A little-known fact is that Congressman Hammerschmidt was the original sponsor of a bill for a national Vietnam Veterans Memorial to be located in Washington, D.C., something he credits his former speechwriter Jim Webb, who later became Secretary of the Navy.
The reason I happened to do that was because of Jim Webb. So he drafted the legislation, and I introduced it. When I introduced it, there was a division among those young Vietnam veterans back from the war. And there's a young guy that was a real promoter, kind of a self-promoter, Jan Scruggs, who became synonymous with the Vietnam Veteran Memorial. And they were very, very upset that I'd introduced that bill because they wanted to save it for more prestigious introduction. So Jack Warner and who's the Maryland congressman? Mac Mathias.
Mac Mathias.
Okay. So then later, about 3 or 4 weeks later, they drafted the same bill, but they had a press conference. And so I went over there, but I didn't say a word to anybody that I'd introduced the bill and let them take all the glory because it was their district. You know, they were both from Virginia and Maryland. But if you go back to the record, you'll see I introduced the original bill. And so, you know, we went to conference and passed the same bill. But,
and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Vietnam Memorial is the most highly visited memorial in Washington.
Probably maybe the World War II might outdo that now.
Another story is that the 1969 Arkansas-Texas game, that President Nixon came to Arkansas. And you came with Winthrop Rockefeller was our governor at that time and whatever. And one of the classic pictures of all times that we see plastered everywhere is that picture in the stadium of you and Nixon and Rockefeller and Bill Fulbright, John McClellan and whoever were all there that day.
Well, I can tell you about our trip. We left Washington, and Jake Pickle and Price and Bush all had on orange stuff, you know, Texas garb, and I didn't have anything red on at that time, and Bill Fulbright, I think, had on a red tie, and that was about it. But anyway, we all boarded the plane at Andrews Field, and those that you've named, plus Henry Kissinger, and plus Nixon's press secretary, I'll think of his name in a minute. We were all on this plane, and we got down to, we had to go to Fort Smith to meet Governor Rockefeller at that time. And it was low ceiling, very low. They couldn't get the big Air Force One plane into Fayetteville. So we got in, they had 3 Marine helicopters, Marine 1, Marine 2, Marine 3. So they put all of us VIPs in that first helicopter, Marine 1. We got in there, and Bush and I were sitting on a bench seat right across from Nixon, was facing Governor Rockefeller, and so they were facing each other. And we were sitting here to where we could be part of their conversation if they so chose. Then behind them was Senator McClellan and Fulbright, and then Bob Price and Jake Pickle and Kissinger and others. So we took off, and we got up to about, well, I'd say it was about Winslow, and the ceiling was only about 200 feet high, and it went right into the hills. So we started circling real low, and we looked down, and cattle were running around in circles. You know, we were spooking those cattle, and I told Bush, I said, well, I hope that constituent up there doesn't know who's up here, because we're running a lot of pounds off his beef. He said, how do you reckon they let a president get into a hairy situation like this? You know, of course, we're both old pilots, you know. And so, anyway, you know, I said, well, probably just good planning. We were kind of laughing about that. He said, you know, he said, when they give the eulogies for all of us on the House floor next Monday, he said, there's so much rank aboard this helicopter, we won't even get our names in the congressional record. So anyway, we got up, you know, the reason we were circling was they had asked for a different landing pattern. They were going to land at Drake Field originally. So Nixon was very irritable about being late. And so he wanted them to get closer. So they landed on the practice field. And so they're getting clearance from FAA, from the controllers, to land on the practice field. So when they finally got that clearance, we took off. We landed in the practice field.
In a helicopter.
In a helicopter. And the game had already started. And they let down the door, and just as Bush and I were coming down the helicopter right behind senators and the governor and the president, this big roar came up in the stadium. I mean, I said, well, hell, Bush, we've scored. You know, I thought, well, we were already ahead because they wouldn't be yelling like that to protect us, you know. So we got up there, and actually we hadn't scored. We had just recovered the fumble. That's what was that roar was all about. But that game was something, and it lasted, you know, right up to the last 3 minutes.
Yeah.
See, we were way ahead in the third quarter.
That's right. This was for the national
championship, and then
the shootout.
But anyway, that was quite an event.
Well, John Paul, I'm just absolutely flabbergasted and amazed and very, very impressed to be here in the John Paul Hammerschmidt Conference Center at North Arkansas College in Harrison, in your hometown, enveloped in all of your pictures and memorabilia and wonderful memories of your private and public career, both in and out of office. And it's just been, it's just an honor to be here. Tell us a little about this place.
David, I'm here sort of accidentally in a way. When I left Congress, Ellen Shipley over at the library in the university wanted me to send her the library and the University of Arkansas all my records, which I did. I complied with that. We sent them a trailer truckload, I think 1,400 boxes over there of all my written material. But I did have a lot of pictures and plaques and all this stuff around, stored away separately. And when I brought it down here, it was stored in a room for 5 years, and Dr. Bill Baker, then president of this college, said, well, we need to do something about that. But previous to that, let me back up a little bit. When I was still in Congress, Vice President George Bush came down here and dedicated a plaza out here and a fountain. And so they had that naming process back there when I was in Congress. And then after I got back, Dr. Baker said they needed this to build an addition here, and could I help them with that? So I wrote them letters to many, many friends and constituents, and they were very forthcoming in all their contributions. As a result, we built the John Paul Hammerschmidt Conference Center, which is a big part of the funding for it, the people that responded to that letter. And I contributed myself to that. But the most rewarding part of this job, of all of it, is serving other people. That's kind of what life's all about anyway. And so that was a reward enough for this job, better than the money or better than any other part of it, was being able to touch people's lives. It's been a wonderful experience.
Well, it's just been a great honor for me to have been here today with my friend and always colleague John Paul Hammerschmidt, who I've known for many years. I've worked with on many occasions, hopefully for the good of our state. And for me to be asked to come by AETN, to come and visit with Congressman Hammerschmidt during this time about his life before politics and in politics and after politics and the afterlife of politics is something I will always treasure and remember. Well, Congressman Hammerschmidt and myself are very, very indebted to AETN for their support of a program like this. We hope that you have enjoyed this. We appreciate being allowed to come into your home so you could be a part of some of this Arkansas and American history. And also to the Center for Oral and Visual History at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, that we hope is going to expand and serve all of the people in all corners of our state in the years and in the generations to come. We're very indebted to the listeners and to those who have viewed our program tonight, and we hope that we'll be able to bring you more in the future. To Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt, thank you, friend.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Thank you.